Welcome to Digital Democracy on Tap. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. It seems like everyone is talking about the COVID-19 vaccines. And while there is a lot of talk, there are also a whole lot of questions. Let's get them answered tonight. We've gathered a panel of professionals to help with that, starting with clinical researcher Kavya Natesan with the Alliance for Multidisciplinary Research. Next, we have Sedgwick County Commissioner Sarah Lopez, then Adrienne Byrne, Health Director of Sedgwick County, and Doctor of Pulmonary Medicine, Chloe Steinshouer. Please ask questions of our panel through the Facebook comments, or you can email us right now. That address is info@kmuw.org. Let's get started. There's the Moderna and the Pfizer, so far the only ones with emergency use authorization from the FDA, and others expected to get approval soon are the Novavax, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca. They all work differently, but how much do those differences matter? And then there are the endless rollout questions. Who is getting the vaccine? People over 70, over 65? Does it depend on who you ask? And of course, who is next in line? There are a lot of details, a lot of gray areas, and a lot of pieces to this beating COVID puzzle. So let's sort it all out together, or at least find all the edge pieces. Kavya, let's start with you as a researcher. Tell us about each of the different vaccines and give us an idea of how they work or will work, assuming they ultimately get approved.
Yeah, for sure. So to begin with, I'll start with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccinations. These are the ones that a lot of people have trepidation about, secondary to the mRNA technology. And for a lot of people, just because the words are a lot of unfamiliar, it's a lot of scientific components to it, it can be a little confusing, which is absolutely understandable. So I'm glad we're doing panels like this to kind of diminish that gray area. So I'm excited to be here today. But to begin with, the mRNA vaccine, I have a little metaphor that I'll kind of allude to here in a little bit. But overall, the scientific explanation, to be as concise as possible, is basically that the mRNA encodes instructions to make a specific protein, which is called the spike protein for coronavirus specifically, because this protein acts like the bad guy, and it's found on the surface of the virus and interacts with our cells. So basically, our immune system is trained to recognize that specific bad guy, which is a spike protein, and is able to generate an immune response. That mRNA, when they give it to us in the vaccination form, it is surrounded by a lipid medium. And so that kind of helps protect the mRNA so it's not degraded before it gets to our cells. And once inside, what the mRNA does, it's basically just a template of instructions. And it helps our cells make a specific spike protein. And that way, when it makes a spike protein, it helps our cells understand how to stimulate the immune system to produce antibodies. And antibodies are the proteins that help us fight an infection. So overall, when you look at it, I know that's a lot of words, but you can basically think of mRNA as a recipe out of like a cookbook. And your cells use that specific recipe to make a dish or some type of item, which is a spike protein. And so once they have the ingredients to make just this protein, they're able to make that specific dish. And once that dish is made, your cell uses that protein to generate an immune response, which is the antibodies and the proteins that help us fight the bad guys against the virus and provide lasting immunity. So overall, it's just helping us that the scientists make this or synthesize the mRNA molecule in the lab and provide us with that specific molecule, and helps our bodies basically make this protein that then helps us generate an immune response. So a lot of the different vaccines right now do work in a similar fashion. For example, Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, which we talked about, is actually made from a harmless adenovirus. And so this is a different virus that often causes a lot of common colds, and that's how we know about it. But it's basically a virus that's made innocuous. So basically it cannot help, you can't initiate an infection in our bodies or anything like that, but it's been modified so it acts as a vector to carry the genetic information or the recipe, again, to make the spike protein. So it acts very similarly beyond that, except for the fact that it uses this virus to carry the code to our cells. And once the code is carried to our cells, then we make the mRNA again and code for the spike protein. The Novavax.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to make sure I understand this. So the Novavax and AstraZeneca both work very similarly with that, sorry, what was it again? mRNA?
mRNA, yeah. So
mRNA.
for messenger ribonucleic acid is what that stands for, and what we can think of it is as this recipe or the instructions. Yeah. So Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca work with the adenovirus, which acts as the vessel to carry the mRNA to our cells, basically, and help our cells code for that. But with Moderna or Pfizer, it just gives us the mRNA itself, and it's not really within a vessel. Whereas with AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, it's in the vessel, which is adenovirus. Yeah. And so Novavax is a little different, though. With Novavax, they give us the spike protein itself. So instead of giving us the mRNA to code for the spike protein or putting that code inside the adenovirus like in AstraZeneca, it's just directly the spike protein itself, and then our body elicits an immune response to that.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, it's a little bit clearer. That's very interesting. So there are a few different kind of ways to get the job done. And,
yes. Yeah. Sometimes it's using a different virus as a vector. Sometimes it's giving us the actual spike protein itself. And sometimes it's giving us the mRNA specifically to help us generate the immune response. And then one common notion is that for somehow this mRNA vaccine is something that can alter our DNA or something like that is often a common misconception. And the reason that that's not feasible is that the mRNA never really enters our nucleus within our cells, because our nucleus is what hosts all the DNA. And that's where all of our genetic information is kept. And so the mRNA never really has a method of getting into the nucleus, so it really cannot alter our DNA at all. So that's one reason that a lot of people have trepidation, and there's no reason to worry about that, because scientifically it doesn't happen that way.
Thank you very much, Kavya. We'll get into more of this, I think, as we go along. But the other day, I was listening to 1A, the NPR show, and I heard an interesting conversation about side effects. And I'd like to share some of that with you. Here's emergency physician Dr. Lena Wen saying how important it is to have clarity on the difference between normal side effects and long-term harm.
So far, we know that the vaccines are very safe. Nobody has died from getting the vaccine. There have been a few adverse reactions in terms of people having allergic reactions to the vaccines. But for the most part, what people are experiencing are these relatively unpleasant but transient side effects. So flu-like symptoms, fever, chills, muscle pain, that sort of thing. These side effects are considered normal. They're also safe and temporary, and they, most importantly, are much safer than actually getting COVID-19.
So that was a relief to me, but I do wonder about the different vaccines, because my brother, for example, is allergic to an ingredient in the Moderna vaccine. And so knowing that there are different kinds that are out there or on their way, Adrienne, since you're in the county health department, can you tell us what we have right now in our community, and is there any rhyme or reason to when we get more and how much more we get?
Yes, and so currently we're receiving primarily Pfizer because we have the ultra cold storage capacity, and a lot of clinics and entities don't. We did receive Moderna in the beginning. The main difference is that Moderna, the second dose is 28 days after, and Pfizer is 21 days after. And I had those side effects that you talked about a day and a half, and then they were gone. So we are at this point receiving 7,000 doses a week of Pfizer. And we didn't receive any last week because I think most across the country did not, because of the weather, and so it didn't ship. And so we were actually down to like 10 for dose ones last week, since we didn't receive our 7,000 in, but we have received our 7,000 this week, and we are on schedule to receive the other 7,000. So we're getting both shipments this week, and we always receive the booster dose. So for Moderna, we would receive the booster dose 2-3 weeks after, because it was 28 days. For Pfizer, we received it 2 weeks after. So there's always this constant flow of vaccine coming in. And then with the state wanting to prioritize school employees, we will also be receiving 3,500 doses of Pfizer, at least for 3 weeks.
Okay. Thank you, Adrienne. Dr. Steinshouer, I want to come to you next. Does it really matter which one we get? or when would it perhaps matter?
So right now the answer is no. The two vaccines that are available to us are functionally almost identical.
Oh yeah, because the Moderna and Pfizer.
Moderna and Pfizer both provide excellent efficacy and effectiveness. So not just efficacy in the trials, but actually effectiveness in the real world, as we're seeing with natural developing immunity in places with high levels of vaccination. So Israel just published a lot of data on their immunity after starting these vaccine programs. And what we're seeing is really excellent reduction in disease severity. The people who get these vaccines, the important thing to know is that they are incredibly effective at reducing severe disease and hospitalizations and death. And that is so important with this. When you can get either Moderna or Pfizer right now, when we start looking at other options becoming available, maybe we need to weigh some of the other elements in how effective the vaccine, or as you mentioned with your brother, the allergic responses and those kind of things. But for right now, the answer is whatever vaccine you can get. Because as you heard, Dr. Nguyen made a very key important note there is you may feel a little poorly when you get this vaccine because it's ramping up your immune system. It's teaching your immune system how to fight. So that if you do get exposed to COVID, number one, you're much less likely to actually develop into disease. And if you actually do develop into disease, the disease is so mild that you aren't ill and having the long-term complications that we're seeing for people with this who get COVID-19 disease.
And I have some audience questions here that I want to get to in a few minutes, but one I will put in here right now because it really relates here. Jessica from Facebook says, how do you know if you are allergic to something in one of the vaccines? And that's, my brother is allergic to like everything. And he's a scientist, so he happens to know this, but yeah, how would someone know?
So I will say that the CDC just puts out something called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And they put one out last week that went over vaccine adverse reactions, responsiveness. We've given out about 14 million vaccines in the United States. And there is an allergic reaction rate of about 4.5 per million, which is slightly higher than the influenza vaccine, significantly lower than the live zoster or shingles vaccine. So I think the problem that we saw was that the very small numbers of people who were being vaccinated early, and we had a few allergic reactions in that group. But what's panned out as more and more people have been vaccinated is that those are not nearly as frequent as they were initially expected to be. One of the primary agents was I believe the polyethylene glycol is one of the ones that has caused some of the biggest problems for allergic responses. And unless you've had something that has that in it, most people don't know if they're allergic to that, but it's an incredibly rare allergic reaction overall. So I think one thing to remember is healthcare workers are not without illnesses of their own. And there are a large number of healthcare workers who do know about allergies and carry EpiPens and have severe reactions. And they were still choosing to get these vaccines, obviously. But the number who actually had significant allergic reactions was very low compared to what was initially portrayed in the media.
Thank you.
And just to supplement that, actually, because we're conducting, I assist with conducting all these trials. And so with all the people that we have vaccinated or, they receive placebo or vaccination, at that point, we've never had to deal with someone having an allergic reaction. We always have a 30-minute observation period. And this is something that's also happening when people are getting the vaccine administered now, just to ensure that there isn't an emergent situation like having anaphylaxis or whatnot. And so during our trials, we haven't run into that thus far at all. And, even when I went to get my vaccine, there was a lot of precautions in place so that even if that something does happen, there's always a nurse, there's always a physician, someone to come to your aid. And so there are those protocol measures in place as well. That's important to be cognizant of.
Yeah, that's very good to know. Now, I want to come to you, Commissioner Lopez. Each state is responsible for their own distribution. Do you think the federal government should take more responsibility than they are currently?
I would say, I don't think any of us from the federal to state to local were prepared for a pandemic in this way. Public health has been funding has been cut all over. It's a national problem. So I don't think any of us were quite prepared. I would just say going forward, whether we should have had something more or not, I'm really hopeful about what we're looking at now. I mean, Biden put out the other day that we're looking to have about 600 million doses available by the end of July. So everybody can have their first dose by the end of July, which is huge. I mean, that is a great first step. And the county is really ready for that. I mean, we have the ability to vaccinate thousands a day between the health department and our community partners. We're ready to start receiving that many doses, and we'll be able to handle that. So whether or not they should have played a bigger role at the beginning, if we could go back, maybe we would, but this is where we are today, and we just really have to look, how do we go forward and how do we get people vaccinated as soon as possible? So we do have a plan.
How did Sedgwick County kind of catch up, or how did, as all of this emerged and has evolved over the last year, how has Sedgwick County kind of gotten up to speed? Or do you think, there's more to do there for the county?
I think the biggest thing that our holdup is just we're not receiving enough doses to give. I mean, we're ready. Like I said, we're prepared to give thousands a day. I know that there's a lot of talk with the state of Kansas reporting one of the lowest states, but in actuality, I really don't think that's the case. I think part of the problem is at a state level, a lot of our IT systems are very outdated. I mean, some of them are still DOS running. We're watching what happens with unemployment, and now we're seeing it on this side too. So we're giving those doses. We're trying to document them as well as we can, but there's an interface problem between a couple of the applications that some of our health providers use, and then getting them to the state and then beyond that. So I hear that all the time, and I really want to say that I don't think that's accurate. We just have to get our IT updated to be able to handle this.
Now, Adrienne, can you explain the rollout phases and what's coming next for Sedgwick County? Where are we now and what's coming next for the county?
So right now we are at 70 and older, and we started in phase 2 with the 65 and older group. But in Sedgwick County, we have over 75,000 individuals who are 65 and older. And the concern was that if we just opened it up, like some areas did, to 65 and older, that the older individuals would kind of be left aside because the younger ones would be getting on the computer and getting appointments. And we know that the older one is, the higher the risk for hospitalization and death. And so that's why Dr. Menz decided to start 90, 87, and we've just incrementally gone down. And of course, the closer we get to 65, the larger the more people are in that age group. And so right now we're at 70 and above. And last week put us a little bit behind because we didn't get enough vaccine to then open up to more 70-year-olds. But after we get to 65 and up and have an opportunity to give that age group time, then we're going to go to public safety. And KDG had added veterinarians at the middle of phase 1, and our vaccine was already allotted, so we've not gotten to the veterinarians yet. So the veterinarians will be after the 65 and older group, along with the public safety, and of course all the school personnel are being vaccinated, are starting that process of being vaccinated right now. So there's just a lot of moving pieces, and we met today with Dr. Menz to begin really outlining how we prioritize the rest of those in phase 2 as we move forward.
When will we know more beyond this, and what is it that we will know that allows for more shifting of the plan?
Well, I think that, the county's really been working on being as transparent as we have with this ever evolving thing called COVID that can change a couple times, or, in an hour sometimes, as far as information and whatnot. So the goal is going to be to be transparent with these groups in phase 2. Now, we're not going to be able to give a particular timeline because it just depends upon the vaccine coming in and then how many in each group are actually wanting to get vaccinated. But it'll help people at least know where they are in that phase. And these phases were set by CDC. So states do have a little bit of wiggle room in there, but CDC has created these phases, and we can move, the health officer can move somewhat in each phase, but not between phases. So we are focusing on phase 2 right now.
And phase 2 goes down to 65. It's 65 and older.
Phase 2 has
Plus the
phase 2 has critical infrastructure, and so we began looking at all the critical infrastructure today, congregate housing, the food service. It's a pretty big, phase 2 has a lot in it.
okay.
And I
And
would
then
just throw in there to get, because we are trying to have these conversations, we're trying to make sure people know what's happening, when it's happening. We are starting to do press conferences with our county manager, I believe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with the news, inviting news in to come in and ask questions, because this does, I mean, as Adrienne and we all know, this changes sometimes by the hour. And so what we tell you on Monday might be completely different by Wednesday or Friday. So making sure we're able to talk to the news outlets and everybody that we can as often as we can is kind of part of our plan going forward, just because of how quickly things change.
And phase 3, what does that what's the summary of what phase 3 would include? Or is it too big to?
Well, phase 3 is large, but it has the critical group of those with chronic conditions and other illnesses that, for whatever reason, are in phase 3 that we are very much in a hurry to get to.
Okay. And do you know, Adrienne, or I don't know who would know how our state's distribution kind of compares with others? How is Kansas doing?
I can say that because there's been a lot, that's a great question, because there's certainly been a lot of discussion and questions around that Kansas is 1% of the United States population. And so we get 1% of the vaccine that is manufactured. And 1% can be a lot, or 1% can be a little. And right now it's not very much, but that's how it all pans out, is it's 1% of what is being manufactured and then shipped.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Now let's go back to Kavya. Obviously right now, not everyone is allowed to get a vaccine, but when it's time for phase 10 or whatever, is it possible it's still not a great idea for some? Tell us who, if anyone, should wait once it's at that point that everyone could.
Optimally at the point that if we're at phase 10 or so, like you said, everyone has the opportunity to get it, where it's great. We're countries like New Zealand or Sweden where the vaccination rate is so optimal. But right now, what I would say, and I think Dr. Steinshouer would agree with this, is that the younger, the healthier people without chronic conditions or comorbidities are the ones that are safer. So as long as we're practicing, our guidelines established by the CDC, continuing to wear a mask, continuing to be vigilant and cautious, that those who are younger and healthier, and by younger and healthier, I mean, 20s, early 30s, and even people, in their 40s, if they're, don't have a lot of conditions or diabetes, hypertension, all those other chronic illnesses. The older that you get, the more your immune system continues to progressively decline. That's just how our cells work. That's just how our bodies function. So, if you look at yourself and you evaluate your health and you don't take a lot of medications, you just do annual physicals at the doctor and you're doing well, then you don't necessarily have to be first in line. And the people that are 50 plus, they start to take a lot of medications. Are they at their parents' degree of decaying health? Maybe not, but they are concerned enough and they're, getting up there, then I would say they're probably further in the front of the line, if that makes sense. So if I, for example, didn't have the opportunity to get the vaccine, I would wait. I would want my mom or my grandparents or other people ahead of me in my community to get it first. So that's kind of how I would self-evaluate that.
Now, something that I've heard from people about a hesitancy over getting the vaccine ultimately whenever they can is that some are concerned about women who are pregnant or might become pregnant. What about the kind of rumor that the vaccine can affect fertility? Where is that coming from, and what is behind that?
I can start on that if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Sure.
So that is a rumor that was actually started without valid scientific background. There is a protein called syncytin-1, which is part of how we develop placental tissue in women. And there is a story that's false that the spike protein resembles syncytin 1 in multiple amino acid areas, which is false. There are not significant similarities to it. Syncytin's like 500 amino acids long, and the spike protein's almost 1,300 amino acids long. They don't look the same. If they were a key in a lock, they would not fit. And the way that you have to think about this, the spike protein is how this virus gets into our cells. So it presents like a key onto a receptor lock on our cells. That key fits into the receptor. In this case, it's the ACE2, angiotensin conversion enzyme. It fits into that lock, and that's how it fits. It gets into our cell and uses our cell to replicate and make its pieces so that it can grow and spread. The syncytin protein doesn't fit. They don't match. They don't sit on the same receptor. They don't touch. So it doesn't affect that. And I think that the most real world straightforward answer to this is that there were multiple women who became pregnant during the vaccination studies and after. And so clearly it did not affect their fertility in that front. And there were no increased cases of fetal demise or loss of pregnancy on the vaccine arm versus the placebo arm. Actually, the placebo arm in the Pfizer-BioNTech study had a higher rate of miscarriage than the vaccination one. The other thing that I will add here is that although this has not been trialed in pregnant women, those trials are being looked at. The major societies that take care of pregnant women, specifically the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, asks women to discuss this with their physicians, but I will tell you that this disease really likes to harm pregnant women. Okay, when we have women who are pregnant, they are very, very sick. And the disease itself is significantly more dangerous than the vaccine. And I think you heard us say that earlier, and I'm going to repeat that now. The vaccine can make you feel a little ill. It can make you have fevers and aches. It can exacerbate your dermatitis or some of your autoimmune sort of symptoms because it's making your immune system work, which is developing your protection. The infection will do that too, but it will do that with a greater detriment. It will attack your heart cells. It attacks your lung cells. We know now that it affects your neurologic system and it attacks your brain. The vaccine doesn't do that. So what we see here is the ability to develop an immunity that appears to be more robust, better against the variants, and safer in the long run without the complications that having the disease itself would cause. I would tell pregnant women to always discuss this with their OB. That is the most important thing. That is a very important relationship. They know the women's health. They know the situation with the pregnancy. But overall, what you'll see is that the societies are showing that the risk of getting COVID is much worse than getting the vaccine.
Okay. Kavya, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and just to follow up with that, and that's specifically what I was going to say too. So Dr. Steinshouer did a great job of taking my words out of my mouth. But in terms of what she was referring to initially as well with regards to that specific protein that was initially hypothesized to have a similar composition, the physician scientist who was actually the one that was initially stipulating this actually later admitted that it doesn't have a similar composition of amino acids at all. And so while it was something that he was initially kind of evaluating, he later noted that, well, I can't really necessarily say this does, like she said, affect the same lock and key receptor model. And so we really don't have any concrete evidence that happens at all. And when you're looking at it from a trial basis, we do perform pregnancy tests on all women before they even get into the trial. So we don't have data from a plethora of pregnant women to be able to say that it causes infertility, like Dr. Steinshauer was saying, because initially when we're letting people in, they're not pregnant. And we do take the pregnancy very seriously because we do pregnancy tests throughout the trial just because it's not FDA regulated, right? And so when we do the pregnancy test and we find out that someone is pregnant, the company that's responsible, us as we're executing the trial, we take a lot of responsibility in calling these women, following up with their pregnancies. We were there every step of the way, and we make sure we gather that information, give it back to the sponsor company, and that's what they give to the FDA. So the process of following these pregnancies is also very diligent. And like she was saying, no one at our site, no one in any of the safety reports that we've seen have had any issues with their pregnancies thus far and are still being followed. So that's what I would add.
And so the person who hypothesized this, when that happened, media picked it up or whatever, and it became a headline and just kind of didn't go away, sounds like.
Yes.
And I want to come back to this sort of idea of misinformation or how things get kind of squirreled around as far as data that the public should be able to consume. But first, I want to come back to you, Commissioner Lopez, and ask, what is the county doing to address communities that are hesitant to get the vaccine? Does the county have any activities for that?
I mean, that's a very real problem. I mean, we have people that just don't have that trust in government or with their, with the health department. And so we're looking at the best way to go about making sure that they feel safe with this. I just did a commercial yesterday with the Health Corps Clinic. They are doing a whole campaign around really targeting minority communities. And so Brandon Johnson, Brandon Whipple, Teresa Lovelady, and myself, we're all kind of trying to say, these are safe. Please don't hesitate to reach out. But I think it's important that when we're involving our community partners, they've already built that trust with their patients in a way that those same patients might not trust us or want to come to the library. So building those relationships with them, having them vaccinate their own patients. We're getting doses to pharmacies around the community. We're going to do mobile outreach clinics. I mean, we're doing as much as we possibly can to get to as many people as we can that can't necessarily or don't want to necessarily come to us where we're having our big site.
Okay. Well, before we move on to some of your questions, for anyone who's just joining us, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo with KMUW, and this is Digital Democracy on Tap. We're talking about the COVID vaccines with Kavya Natesan, clinical researcher with the Alliance for Multidisciplinary Research, Dr. Chloe Steinshouer, a pulmonologist and doctor who sees a lot of COVID patients, Sedgwick County Commissioner Sarah Lopez, and Adrienne Byrne, Director of Sedgwick County Health Department. You can join the conversation through questions on Facebook or email them to info@kmuw.org. Adrienne, can my mom pick which one she gets if she waits for her turn with the county?
We are going to likely have Pfizer, and so no, it's going to be Pfizer. And the good thing with Pfizer, there's just 21 days between versus 28.
Awesome. And with the Johnson & Johnson, when that one comes out and like all the vaccines are out, will there be kind of a menu someday of these vaccines, do you think?
That is a good question, and we're hoping that more vaccines come out because then we can vaccinate more people. So right now, Moderna and Pfizer are what we have, and they're very good with the efficacy that they have. Johnson & Johnson, there's still a lot to be known about that because one dose, maybe two doses, because 65% efficacy is not quite what is wanted. So more to come on that.
Okay, I'm going to get to a couple of audience questions here. Julie sent us an email saying, for the vaccine distribution phases that make the doses available to those with severe medical risks, what defines severe? Would having high blood pressure being considered obese, or having a certain blood type be severe enough for patients to be considered for earlier phases? I don't know who wants to take that one.
Right now, that is not an option. I did ask KDHE, our state health department, if there had been discussion around moving, for example, those with cancer into phase 2 and others that are very at risk. And they said there had been discussion, but there was no movement at this time.
And I would add on to that, we've been discussing that as a commission and how we can see what we can do about that, because we know that there are people who aren't in this age group, 65 and older, that are at such a higher risk even than our elderly people on chemo. But the word severe is such a hard, it's hard to say this one's severe and this one isn't. So we have looked at, if Dr. Mins, and we could get that even moved, which I don't know if we're going to be able to. But if we could get them moved up, then how do we decide who's severe and who isn't? And so I think we would really have to work with family physicians, and they would have to tell us yes or no, because I can't sit here and tell you if what you have is going to be more severe than someone else. So we're going to have to rely on them. But again, I don't know if that's even going to be an option, just because we have to stay within the phase we're in. Like Adrienne said, Dr. Mintz can kind of move around within the phase, but to go from phase 3, which those individuals are in, to move them to phase 2, the state has to approve that.
Mm. And this might be, I'm not sure how separated you can talk about a pre-existing condition versus severe medical risks, but Elaine on Facebook has a couple of questions about pre-existing conditions, asking how will people with pre-existing conditions be able to find out what phase we're in? What do we do if we have a rare condition not listed in the criteria? And is Kansas still separating pre-existing conditions between phases 3 and 4? So that's kind of a little platter of questions from Elaine.
And I can say that we're not quite there yet. We had the meeting today about prioritizing the rest of phase 2. And what we find with the phases is that there's generalities, and we know that there are a lot of specific industries, specific illnesses. There's things missing within those phases. And so that's part of what the vaccine prioritization committee looks at, and that we're doing research on, and also hearing from people that ask us questions that we hadn't thought about, that where they aren't part of a group, or we hadn't thought about that specific particular industry that then needs to fit into critical infrastructure. So more to come on that.
Okay. Dr. Steinshouer, let's talk a bit about the COVID variants. We are seeing them in Kansas now, but to what extent do we see those variants, and what are you anticipating over the next month or two?
So the answer is that we know we have variants, and we have them in most of the states in the United States. The problem is we don't know how widespread the variants are, because we do not do the genomic sequencing at the same rate that countries around the world, particularly the UK, who honestly leads that. So we know we have them. How ubiquitous are they right now? We don't know yet. The concern is that the variants that we know about, or that have been mostly brought up, which are California, UK, South Africa, and then Brazil, all have increased infectivity, which means they transmit better. So they spread easier. So that creates a problem in that you create clusters again. And if you remember early in the pandemic where we started having clusters, which then created community spread, that's the concern that we have for those. The more concerning factor for someone like me, who works primarily in the ICU, is they appear to make people also more ill. And with these, we seem to be seeing a slightly different presentation now than we saw 6 months ago. We still see severe lung injury, we still see severe pneumonias and what we call ARDS, but we're also seeing more cardiac problems or more heart issues in these patients. We're seeing more heart rhythm problems, we're seeing more congestive heart failure or weakness of the heart muscle itself from myocarditis. And the concern is that that may be related to variant strains, because that's not the constellation of presentations that we've had necessarily before. So we watch closely, we're managing, but the sequencing is done at a much higher level than at the individual hospitals. It's done at the state level, it's done at the federal level. And so that's something that we, from a day-to-day perspective, honestly, it doesn't matter much to me, because I have to take care of these people with the same series of treatments. There's been no new treatments that have been shown to be more effective in the variants. But from a public health perspective, as Adrienne can attest, there is going to be an issue if we start seeing clusters from this highly infectious variant. And that's why all of the measures that we've been pushing for a year, with social distancing and mask wearing and hand hygiene and good ventilation and avoiding aerosol spread, they still matter even when we're vaccinated. Because what we know, part of the issue with the vaccine data is that some of these vaccines are being tried in more difficult scenarios, right? So you're looking at the adenovector vaccines, which are being tried in the era of variants, and often in places that have variants, like the UK or South Africa. Well, they're in a challenging situation. You know, that you're trying it against the worst one that we have out there right now. So if they're not as effective, that doesn't mean they're bad. They are still incredibly efficacious at reducing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. They just aren't as efficient at preventing all disease, right? So that doesn't make that vaccine bad. It just means that you might get mild disease as compared to the early data from the mRNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and the Moderna, which have even seemed to prevent that. So the variants are going to create new problems as we move forward. The hope would be to vaccinate enough people that those variants can't take hold and continue to spread. If you get enough people vaccinated, then you don't have vectors to spread the disease through, and you don't spread it in the community anymore. And essentially, you snuff out that fire.
I have another clip that I'd like to share, and it kind of echoes what you're saying, Dr. Steinshouer. This is from an episode of Science Friday regarding the vaccine's efficacy against the variants with Dr. Stephen Goldstein, a research associate in evolutionary virology at the University of Utah.
If you got a cough or a fever, whether alone or together, and that's the worst that happened, that would be considered an event that's a vaccine failure. But what we have seen is these vaccines still seem completely effective against the variants at preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death, which are really the bottom line for most of us. If the vaccines lose some efficacy at preventing you from essentially getting a cold, but your chances of getting really sick or dying are still 0%, that's a pretty great outcome.
So does that seem like a pretty good summary to you, Dr. Steinshouer?
He's much more succinct and smart about saying that, but that's really what I'm going for. I think the important thing to recognize about these vaccines is those numbers that people throw out and that the media loves to give us, 65%, 95%, all of those. That is prevention of disease, period. All comers, disease of any type. But when you get into the fine print and you get into the weeds of those studies, these people are not ending up in the hospital. They are not dying. And that's the most important thing that this vaccine is doing. Because COVID itself is killing, we've 500,000 people dead in the United States. That's a huge number from this disease in 1 year. And that's significantly more than we see from influenza. It's significantly more than we see from almost any infectious disease that we deal with.
And to add to that, so the process and everything that Dr. Steinshouer is saying, it's for another example, that's something that's very common. Like she said, influenza. Every year we have to get a new influenza vaccine because that virus also mutates. It's not just COVID that mutates. And viruses, the reason that they're so pervasive is their ability to do that. They're very small molecules that are very minimalist, but secondary to how they infect people, they mutate at crazy rates. And so even when we get the flu shot, a lot of people still get the flu. But like she said, that saves you from hospitalization or death in very many instances. So just like very many other viruses that set the precedent for COVID, this is very similar in that regard as well. So yes, there are mutations, and yes, our data could be, obviously Johnson & Johnson right now is in the 60s and AstraZeneca's in the 70s. But like she said, secondary to these mutations, there's only so much that we can garner about that. But the bottom line is these vaccines are effective, and the risks of COVID far outweigh the risk of just getting one of these vaccines. And in many cases, like the clip we just heard, it saves you from death or hospitalizations. And during these trials, my role too is not just to execute the trials, but to talk to patients all the time. You have a new change in your health. Where have you been since the last time we saw you? Have you had exposure to COVID? And we get all this data and we see how many times they do go out in the public, they go grocery shopping, they hang out with their family, they go see their friends. But we do COVID tests and we do swabs and we see, not as many cases as you would expect because the vaccine does have efficacy, and that's what's important. And we haven't seen a lot of hospitalizations with COVID, even though we do have COVID cases. And so bottom line, whether or not it completely prevents it isn't the problem or the answer or the solution even. You're in a better space getting the vaccine than not, and it's all relative.
So do you think that it'll be ultimately the kind of thing that we'll get a shot for, a COVID shot every year, like for the flu?
And that's something that they're still kind of assessing right now. We're not really sure what the trajectory of the virus will ultimately be. But some people right now do feel like that could be something pervasive enough that every year it's something that we're going to have to fight against. And if you look at the replication cycle of this virus, we're not getting rid of it very efficiently. I mean, like she just said, 500,000 deaths, that's pervasive. And I don't even know when we'll, quote, eliminated entirely, and the vaccine schedule is limited and we have so many limited resources and we're doing everything that we can, but that isn't optimal. And so if it comes down to the fact that it's still here a year from now or here 9 to 10 months from now, then vaccines are going to have to, we're going to have to restart that within the next year. And we're going to have, and the antibody response too is something that we still have to look at. We're still getting data on to what degree it's sustained. First, people were thinking it's around 3 months that the antibodies hang around and, continue to protect you. But now we're getting data that it's more closer to 6 months. But as we continue to follow research participants, as we continue to follow people who receive the vaccine, we'll get more numbers on that. And it's still kind of new in that regard. And so, yes, there is a possibility, not maybe forever like influenza. We've been doing that for some time, but there is a possibility that this could go on for a lot longer than people anticipated.
I want to come back to the concept about the confusion and misinformation or just the complexity of this entire issue. The conversation around the vaccines working against the COVID variants does confuse a lot of people. And how do you help people to cope with that complexity there or the misinformation regarding the vaccine? What are some of the strategies that I'll put this to all of you, what do you all do to help people to kind of find information that is worthy as far as you can see?
So
sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just real quick. When it comes to our on a trial basis, right? We see patients every day and we have a plethora of documents that we provide them with all the new information that comes out. So we say, hey, yes, we know there's variants, but this is the good part about getting the vaccine. The benefits of this still outweigh not getting anything. And we know this is a concerning situation, but based off of what we have, this is the optimal course of action. So it's kind of empowering patients to understand what is going on from a scientific realm, giving them the information in a manner that's digestible and that you're understanding, and providing them with the assurance that being in the trial, getting the vaccine is really the best way to go right now. And because we monitor their health so constantly, we have physicians, we have nurses, we have resources to take care of them. It's basically just empowering them and assuring them that we have what we need to take care of them right now and that we're doing everything possible. It's kind of what it comes down to from a research realm.
Yeah, I'll tackle a little more on the clinical side. So I take care of patients every day, and this is a discussion I have. I take care of lung patients, people with chronic lung disease. And honesty, I think, is the key here. There are things we don't know, and it's okay to tell people we don't know, right? What's most important is to take the information we have and provide it with honest context. One of the things I think that happens in the media is that context is lost. We spend a lot of time in training to gain something called scientific literacy, right? It's learning a whole new language. It's learning a whole new way to think. And so things that make sense to me because I spent a decade in school learning that, I have to figure out how to make it into a way that somebody else who is trained in something completely different than I am, get it into a language that they understand so that they have the ability to make that decision and feel like they're a partner in care. It shouldn't be me driving it into them. It should be me helping them understand and feel confident that the decision is the right one for them. So vaccine hesitancy is normal. It's important to help people develop the language and the literacy around the information that's there, and then to be honest and provide good quality information. This should not be things that are screenshots from the internet. These should not be meme-based. These should not be from email chains. These should be things that are coming from tried and true sources. I think the CDC has done an excellent job in the last month of really updating their vaccine website. There is a ton of information on there that is very transparent. The language is put multiple ways to try and make it as accessible as possible. The vaccine data is there. They release these updates. Like I said, they release to physicians and practitioners as well. That Morbidity and Mortality Weekly put exactly the numbers that we've seen for vaccines in the United States. And like I said, that's 14 million vaccines that have been given out in the month of January. In that, there were about 650 severe events. That math is astonishing. That is less than 0.005, I believe, less than 0.005% people who got a vaccine who had a severe reaction. That's an incredibly safe vaccine, right? So it's important that we take these numbers and we present them to people and we give them somewhere to feel safe, to ask those questions, to not be shamed by asking the questions. It's fair to be concerned. The biggest question I take is that they feel like it was railroaded through. It was pushed through too soon. It came out too fast. Here's the thing. mRNA, those mRNA companies, they've been in business for 20 years. This is a vaccine 2 decades in the making. It was the perfect storm that allowed this to happen. You have a technology that's been waiting. You have improvements in our DNA and RNA sequencing that allowed us to rapidly determine what this virus looks like and is made from, and put those two things together, and we could produce a vaccine quickly. That's the beauty of these mRNA vaccines. They can be made fast, and they can be made for variants fast. They're also incredibly effective, as we're seeing. But how do we know that? We had a disease that was out of control. So we had huge amounts of exposure. So you're able to say that somebody had high exposures and high risk, but didn't contract the disease because it was there in mass. When you have a sporadic disease, like it's cohorts. So think of SARS. SARS was so long ago that we didn't have the genetic technology to make these things this fast. MERS, which is similar, spreads so sporadically that there aren't enough cases to say that somebody's had an adequate amount of exposure to show that the vaccine worked. So now you have technology, advancement in science, money being dedicated to this, and enough exposure to be able to prove that the vaccine works quickly. So that's what allowed these vaccines to become available so quickly. It's not that they cheated on the research or skipped any steps. A lot of those steps were able to be fast-tracked because the perfect set of scenarios happened.
Wow. That's amazing. I've never heard this.
And with regards to the research side of that, we still had phase 1 of trials. We still had a phase 2, and then we went to a phase 3. We never went from phase 1 immediately to emergency use authorization or anything like that. Like you said, all the steps were still followed, and everything that we did had to get approval first before we moved on to phase 2. Was this safe? What dose is giving us efficacy? How can we translate this to a larger population? All these questions were addressed, and it's been streamlined. The process wasn't skipped, it was streamlined. And so while we were given more resources and, like she said, money, really to make sure that we were able to push this to the FDA, it's still the same amount of data, it's still the same quality of data, just more attention to detail because we're in a more emergent situation. And so from me conducting trials for the last few years, we've put just as much effort into this and just as much time as if I was doing a RSV vaccine or an influenza vaccine. And just like she said with the mRNA technology, just last year, actually, Moderna was looking at an influenza trial using an mRNA-based vaccine too. And Zika virus, a lot of other viruses, a lot of big companies have been messing with mRNA technology for a while, just in the last few years, and made significant improvement. And so not just mRNA tech, but mRNA in the paradigm of vaccines isn't new either. And so again, we've just been given adequate resources and the time and the money and the ability to translate this into an emergent situation.
Yeah, I will say from a physician standpoint, at least the nerdy ones who like weird science, mRNA was published in Nature talking about mRNA vaccines in 2017 and 2018. So this is not new. They've been waiting for something for this to work. This, just like I said, is the perfect storm to be able to get the research in a timely fashion to show that it's effective. We've been waiting for this because this appears to be a technology that is going to be incredibly effective moving forward at other things as well. This just happened to be the most successful.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for those responses. I want to get to a couple more audience questions here. Gay sent an email saying, if nurses and doctors can mask up, wear a gown, gloves, and a shield, and then go in a patient's room to treat someone with COVID, why can't family members choose to do the same and be with a dying relative? Dr. Steinshouer, do you think that would be something you can talk to?
I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I think the problem is that I'm not just wearing a mask, I'm wearing a fitted mask. So I'm in the hospital right now, which is why I'm wearing all of my gear. I'm in a communal space. I actually have an N95 on right now. It's got a plugged space valve here. It's got an N95 filter. It is fitted to me. It has been tested. I actually have to do noxious airflow testing with it to make sure that nothing comes into it. And so we can't fit these. This is a respirator. That's what we wear in the hospital. It's not a mask.
Mm.
And so that's a little different, and we can't fit those on people. And there's still a bit of unpredictability that we're accepting a risk doing healthcare that I don't know that I can put onto somebody else. If we give chemotherapy to a patient and you are not supposed to touch them because it can come out through their pores or through their urine or through anything else, my staff is trained and knows how to do that, but also is accepting a risk in doing that. We don't ask the community to go fight fires. We don't ask the community to do law enforcement. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there to say that all we're doing is putting on a mask and a gown and going into these rooms. We want family members here as much as anybody. There is data to show that in the ICU, when you have family present, people do better. We want people here. The problem is that we've had incidences where people have brought COVID into the hospital and transmitted it to a family member without knowing they had it. We've had people who have visited family members and then come back later because they are then COVID positive. So some of it right now is a infection control measure because we've spent so many months with out of control disease in the hospital. But yeah. I will say we really want people here. We want families here. We want people with their families. That's the most important thing. But it has to be safe, not only at an individual personal level, it has to be safe at a community level, because right now it's not just about any one person. It's about the community at large.
So at the rate we're going now, when do you think we'll either reach herd immunity when life could kind of go back to normal, theoretically, or an in-between time where things could maybe get better and that we could maybe do things like seeing our relatives in the hospital or other social activities? Not that it's a social activity. But
so in the hospital, I'll advocate for something, and then I'll let Adrienne take over because I know she's got some good thoughts on this. In the hospital, the only people who have visitor isolations are people who are on active isolation for COVID-19, which means they're probably still aerosolizing virus. Okay, they are spreading it actively. Those are the only people who are not allowed visitors in the hospital. Right now, the hospital is still limiting visitation to a single visitor who is screened for temperature and symptoms and things like that. And that's to protect our patients and our staff. But we are creating policies and we are adapting in ways to try and optimize the situation as much as we can to get families in here. Because like I said, we want our families in here with these patients. It's important. So the only people right now are people who are still in isolation. Once they reach the threshold that they are no longer infectious, we allow families to come visit them.
Okay.
We are where we are because of all the sacrifices that the community has made and the choices that people have made. And we are in a marathon. So we have a ways to go. This is not going to go away in 2021. We're not going to, and who knows what the new normal is going to look like. Some of this is going to carry, over because there's been some positives in this craziness and difficult time. But for now, I mean, social distancing and mask wearing and hand hygiene. Look what it's done to the flu in our community this year. We hardly have any flu. We still get the flu shot, and that's what one of the important things I wanted to touch on for a minute that had been talked about. The flu shot, as far as why should we get this if the efficacy is not the greatest? We get flu shots every year before we know exactly how effective it's going to be or not, and even if it ends up being 43%. I might get the flu, but it's going to keep me from getting very, very ill, and that's a reason to get the COVID vaccine as well, regardless of that.
Adrienne, I wanted to ask you also before we run out of time here, how much does the county coordinate with other clinics and pharmacies? You mentioned the partners, these other locations where people can get a vaccine. Does everything come to the county first and then you kind of give to some of those different partners?
At this point, the vaccine does come to the health department, and there are approved vaccine providers through our state health department that pharmacies and some clinics around town have been approved for, but we can still redistribute to clinics even if they aren't an approved provider. That just means that we're responsible for the paperwork and the data entry and all that, versus someone that's an approved provider we can actually transfer the vaccine to, and they do the paperwork and the data entry, and they're responsible for the vaccine. So we're in the process now that we're getting more vaccine in, that we are, and the school the school personnel being a focus to get done or started in the next 2 or 3 weeks is really helping us venture out more as well, that we're connecting with pharmacies and we're connecting with pediatrician group that are going to really be partners in getting people vaccinated. So we are very much excited about there being other access points besides our main clinic and our drive-throughs. That's going to be a very important part of this community and giving more access points.
We're running up against the end of our time here, but I have, I think, 2 more audience questions I want to see if we can squeak out here. Susan sent an email asking, when will WSU faculty be vaccinated? I only see K through 12 teachers on the phase plan. Are we included in phase 3 as other vital government employees?
Actually, the faculty was moved into phase 2. Now they're going to be towards the bottom of phase 2 because of risk of transmission, risk of serious disease if they're not in one of those groups ahead of time, like 55 and older. But so they were moved up to faculty, were moved to phase 2, but they're going to be towards the end because of risk factors.
Excellent. Last question, maybe to hit here from an audience member. Also from Julia via email, looking back at COVID testing, are there any plans to also add testing for COVID antibodies at the same time? Would it be helpful to know if we have COVID antibodies and could therefore perhaps stand at the end of the line for vaccines? That's a good
I'm
question.
gonna real quick comment on that the antibody test isn't necessarily 100% accurate, nor does it give us enough data to apply universally. For example, the Moderna vaccine, for some people, it does show up on the antibody test, but a lot of times it doesn't. Our proteins are very, very specific, and testing for antibodies is extremely specific. And so a lot of vaccinated people that we have unblinded in the trials who definitely got the real deal, they go get an antibody test and it's going to show up as negative. And so really the safe bet is to get the vaccine when you're able to and continue, like we all talked about, exercising those precautionary measures, but do not depend on the antibody test for validity.
Because there's also a lot of false positives.
Agreed. And I'm gonna throw something else out there. So you've got to remember that COVID is a coronavirus. There are 4 endemic coronaviruses that we see every year that are a common cold. Many of the antibody tests actually cross-react to those. So the common cold can actually make it seem like you have antibodies and you do not. Number 2 is that there is a clear difference between native coronavirus immunity and vaccine-related immunity, in the sense that people who have had COVID, we are seeing reinfection, especially with variant types. So it does not appear to have the same ability to protect you as the vaccine does. Number 3 is that some of the vaccine immunity is actually cellular, T cell and B cell related, which means the antibody test doesn't matter. There is a whole separate level of immunity that is not antibody related, which helps us to produce antibodies when they're needed. But these are the memory cells. These are the things that recognize when bad antigens come in and start creating that army to fight. So the antibody test alone is not sufficient to tell you for immunity.
Very interesting. Thank you all so much for such an informative discussion. I really learned a lot, and I hope that you watching learned something valuable tonight as well that you can share with others. This Digital Democracy on Tap conversation is sponsored by Susan and Leon Moeder of Moeder Associates, so we thank them. And I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. Thank you for joining us. Tell your friends and family that they can watch this conversation on our website under the events tab at engageict.org. Thanks again. Stay healthy and stay strong. We'll get through this together. Good evening, everyone.